What if the only person who could save a decorated war hero wasn't among the 22 surgeons who'd given up, but a single father pushing a mop bucket down a forgotten hallway? When the entire surgical team at Stonewood Memorial Hospital declared 4-star General Thania Foster beyond saving, no one dared question their verdict until a quiet janitor named Nolan Curtis noticed something the monitors couldn't detect. A whisper. A rhythm. A heartbeat hiding beneath the noise of machines. This is the remarkable true story of how one man's refusal to look away awakened more than just a patient. It exposed a broken system, restored a hero's voice, and proved that sometimes the most important observations come from those society trains us to ignore. If stories like this move you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel, where we share powerful tales of courage, compassion, and second chances that remind us all what it means to truly see someone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Stonewood Memorial Hospital hummed with that particular frequency that existed only in places where time moved differently, where seconds stretched into hours in waiting rooms, and where entire lifetimes could end between one monitor beep and the next. The hallways gleamed under the night shift's perpetual glow, polished to a shine that reflected nothing but emptiness. Nolan Curtis pushed his cleaning cart down the 7th-floor corridor with the practiced rhythm of a man who had learned to become invisible. His Navy work uniform hung loose on his frame, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms marked with faded scars that told stories he no longer shared. The name tag pinned crookedly to his chest read simply, N. Curtis, Custodial Services. No one ever asked what the N stood for. No one ever looked long enough to wonder. He moved through Stonewood Memorial like a ghost, present but unseen, essential but unacknowledged. His route was always the same. Start at the East Wing, work through intensive care, loop past the surgical recovery rooms, and finish near the private suites reserved for high-ranking officials and wealthy patients who demanded silence along with their treatment. Tonight, like every night for the past 3 months, his path took him past room 714. The door stood partially open, as it always did. Hospital policy required it for patients under constant monitoring, though Nolan had noticed the monitoring had become less constant with each passing week. Inside, beneath sterile white sheets, and surrounded by machines that beeped in mechanical sympathy, lay General Thania Foster. Nolan paused at the doorway, his hands still gripping the cart handle. He had passed this room 47 times in the last 3 weeks. He had counted. And each time, something about it pulled at him with an insistence he couldn't explain. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't the rank displayed on the plaque beside the door. It was something older, something instinctual, something that whispered in a language he had learned on battlefields half a world away. The general's uniform hung in the closet, visible through the half-open door. 4 silver stars gleamed even in the dim light. Her service record, from what Nolan had overheard in passing conversations between nurses, was legendary. 2 decades of distinguished service. Multiple combat deployments. Commendations that filled an entire wall. She had been investigating something he'd heard. Something about procurement irregularities and misallocated funds. When the helicopter, carrying her back from an inspection tour, had experienced catastrophic mechanical failure. The crash had left her here, in this room, in this state that the doctors called persistent vegetative, a term Nolan had always hated for its clinical cruelty. For 3 months, General Thania Foster had existed in the space between life and death, breathing but not waking, present but unreachable. Nolan glanced down the hallway. Empty. The night nurse was doing rounds on the opposite wing. The attending physician had left hours ago. He stepped into the room, moving quietly despite knowing she couldn't hear him. The habit of silence ran deep. He had been in rooms like this before, though the setting had been different. Makeshift field hospitals in Kandahar. Bombed-out clinics in Mosul. Transport choppers where the only medical equipment was whatever you could carry on your back. and the only anesthesia was the unconsciousness of shock. Nolan had been a combat medic for 12 years before the discharge that had come not from physical wounds, but from the kind that didn't show on x-rays. Now he cleaned floors in the same type of facility where he had once saved lives, and most days he told himself that was enough. Most days he believed it. He moved to straighten a fallen IV line, an old instinct he couldn't suppress. As he did, his eyes swept across the monitors displaying vital signs that hadn't meaningfully changed in weeks. Steady heartbeat, regular respiration, brain activity that registered just enough to keep the machines from alarming but not enough to suggest consciousness. The medical team had been clear in their prognosis, no meaningful recovery expected. But as Nolan's hand brushed near the bed rail, something made him stop. A sound, so faint he almost missed it beneath the mechanical symphony of medical equipment. A soft exhalation that didn't quite match the rhythm of the ventilator. He froze, listening with the intensity of someone trained to detect the difference between wind and movement in hostile territory. There it was again, not imagined, a subtle variation in her breathing pattern, lasting barely 2 seconds before returning to the mechanical normal. Nolan leaned closer, watching her face. General Foster's features were still, almost serene. Her eyes remained closed, but there, just at the corner of her left eye, the finest tremor of muscle movement. His pulse quickened. He knew what the doctors would say. Involuntary reflex, muscular spasm, meaningless noise in a system shutting down. He had heard those explanations before, had even accepted them once or twice. But he had also learned to trust what his hands felt and his eyes saw, even when machines said otherwise. Nolan pulled out his phone, checking the time. 11:47. He made a mental note, though he wasn't sure why. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He spoke to a patient who couldn't answer back. "General," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, if you're in there somewhere, I need you to know something." He paused, feeling foolish but continuing anyway. "You're not alone, and I'm not ready to stop looking." No response. No movement. Just the steady beep of monitors and the whisper of recycled air through ventilation systems. Nolan straightened, shaking his head at his own sentimentality. He was seeing things because he wanted to see them, finding patterns in randomness because the alternative was admitting that sometimes people were truly beyond reach. He returned to his cart and continued down the hallway, but his mind remained in room 714. The tremor had been real, he was certain of it. And if it was real, if it meant something, then the question wasn't whether he had imagined it. The question was what he was going to do about it. By the time Nolan reached the end of his shift at 6 in the morning, he had made a decision. He pulled out a small notebook from his locker, one he had carried during his deployment years. Its pages filled with observations and field notes that had once meant the difference between life and death. He opened to a blank page and wrote in careful print, Day 1, November 3rd, 2347 hours. Subject, General T. Foster, Room 714. Observed, irregular breathing pattern lasting approximately 2 seconds. Facial micro-movement, left periorbital region. Possible voluntary response, requires additional observation. He closed the notebook and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he walked out into the cold morning air, heading toward the bus stop that would take him home to his small apartment where his daughter would be waking soon, needing breakfast before school. As he walked, Nolan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped onto a path that would change everything. He just didn't know how much. The autumn sun broke weakly through the clouds as Nolan Curtis stepped off the bus 3 blocks from Stonewood Memorial Hospital. His shift didn't start for another 2 hours, but he had learned long ago that the quiet moments before dawn were when truth revealed itself most clearly. When the hospital operated with minimal staff and maximum routine, when the vigilant eyes of administration were still closed, and when a janitor could move through hallways with even less notice than usual. He carried a paper bag containing his dinner, a sandwich made from yesterday's bread, and a thermos of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. In his jacket pocket, the small notebook pressed against his ribs like a secret. He had added 3 more entries since that first night, each one documenting the subtle signs that everyone else seemed determined to miss. Day 2. Breathing irregularity repeated at 2,319 hours. Duration, 3 seconds. Heart rate variance of 2 beats per minute, coinciding with observation. Day 3. Right hand finger tremor. Minimal but distinct. Occurred during overhead page announcement. Possible auditory stimulus response. Day 4. Eyelid flutter, both eyes, lasted 4 seconds. No corresponding change in EEG readings per monitor display. Nolan had been careful, methodical, watching from the doorway during his regular rounds, never lingering long enough to draw attention. But with each observation, his certainty grew. General Thania Foster was not as absent as her medical charts claimed. Something remained, some awareness flickering beneath the surface like a candle flame behind frosted glass. The question that kept Nolan awake during his few hours of sleep was simple. Why had no one else noticed? Stonewood Memorial employed some of the finest medical professionals in the region. The General's care team included neurologists, specialists, and surgeons whose credentials covered entire walls. Yet somehow, they had all concluded that recovery was impossible, that the woman in room 714 had already departed, leaving only biological processes behind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nolan signed in at the custodial office, exchanged brief nods with the day shift supervisor, and collected his cart. The familiar smell of industrial cleaning solution and floor wax greeted him like an old companion. He had been working at Stonewood for 14 months now, ever since the custody hearing that had rearranged his entire world. The memory still stung with the sharpness of fresh injury, though it had been over a year. The courtroom had been smaller than he expected, almost intimate in its cruelty. His ex-wife's attorney had been efficient and devastating, painting a picture of instability and unreliability. Former combat medic with documented PTSD, multiple job changes, difficulty maintaining consistent housing. The evidence mounted like stones in a wall designed to separate him from his daughter. Nolan had tried to explain that the job changes were about finding the right fit, that the housing moves were about staying close to his daughter's school district, that the PTSD was managed and under control, but explanations sounded like excuses in that sterile room. And the judge had ruled with regrettable firmness. Primary custody to the mother, supervised visitation for the father. Every other weekend, 4 hours each visit, always with a social worker present. His daughter's name was Summer. She was 8 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and Nolan's stubborn chin. She loved science experiments and hated broccoli. She collected smooth stones from the park and kept them in a shoebox under her bed. And every time Nolan saw her during those brief, supervised visits, he could feel the distance growing, not because she loved him less, but because the world had decided he was someone to be monitored rather than trusted. That's why he had taken the job at Stonewood Memorial. His ex-wife worked in the administrative wing on the 3rd floor. If he couldn't have custody, he could at least exist in the same building, breathe the same air, be nearby in case she ever needed him. It was a compromise with circumstance, a way of staying tethered to the one person who mattered most. He pushed his cart toward the 7th floor, his mind already shifting into the focused awareness that had kept him alive in combat zones. Room 714 appeared ahead, its door still ajar according to protocol. Nolan slowed as he approached, his eyes scanning for medical staff. The morning nurse was at the central station, absorbed in her computer screen. The hallway stretched empty in both directions. He paused at the threshold, looking in at General Foster. In the pale morning light filtering through the window, she appeared almost peaceful, her face relaxed in a way that contradicted the violence of her injuries. The ventilator breathed for her in steady mechanical rhythm. The monitors displayed their endless stream of data that everyone had already decided told a complete story. But Nolan had learned something during his years in field medicine. Machines measure what they're designed to measure, and nothing more. They count heartbeats, but not hope. They track brain waves, but not their will to return. Sometimes, the most important signs existed in the spaces between data points, in the patterns that emerged only when someone cared enough to watch. "Morning, General," he said quietly, speaking as much to himself as to her. "I'm still here, still watching." He pulled a small penlight from his pocket, one he had kept from his medic days. Checking to make sure he remained unobserved, he stepped closer to the bed and gently lifted her left eyelid, shining the light briefly across her pupil. The response was sluggish but present, pupillary constriction, slight but measurable. He tried the right eye, same response, perhaps fractionally slower. Nolan's heart rate climbed. This wasn't absence, this was presence, diminished and distant, but real. He heard footsteps in the hallway and quickly pocketed the penlight, returning to his cart. A doctor he didn't recognize strode past, without a glance, white coat billowing. Nolan resumed his routine, mopping the already clean floor, while his mind raced with possibilities. If she could respond to light, what else might she respond to? Sound had shown some promise based on his observations. What about touch? Temperature? Familiar voices? Or music? The field of consciousness research was complex, far beyond his training, but Nolan understood the basics. The brain was not a binary system. Between fully aware and completely absent existed vast territories of partial function, locked-in states, and minimal consciousness that standard assessments often missed. He finished the 7th floor and moved down to the 6th, his movements automatic while his thoughts churned. He needed help, someone with the expertise and authority to properly evaluate what he was seeing, but approaching the medical staff directly had already proven futile. 3 days ago, he had mentioned his observations to a nurse, carefully framing them as questions rather than claims. She had smiled with professional patience and explained that reflexive responses were common in vegetative states and didn't indicate awareness. When he had pressed, suggesting that perhaps the care team might want to run additional tests, her smile had cooled. "Sir, I understand you mean well, but General Foster has been evaluated by 22 of the region's top surgeons and neurologists. I think they know better than the custodial staff." The dismissal had been polite but absolute. Nolan had backed off then, but the encounter had clarified something important. Within the hospital hierarchy, he existed below the threshold of credibility. His observations didn't matter because his position predetermined their invalidity. He was the person who mopped floors, not the person who made diagnoses. But he was also the person who had kept soldiers alive when everyone else had written them off. The person who had learned to read signs that machines missed. The person who understood that expertise could become a cage when it closed off the possibility of being wrong. By the time his shift ended, Nolan had made a decision. If the hospital wouldn't listen, he would find someone who would. He changed out of his work uniform in the locker room, pulled on his civilian clothes, and walked 6 blocks to a modest office building wedged between a coffee shop and a tax preparation service. The brass nameplate beside the 3rd floor door read, "Clara Jennings, Attorney at Law, specializing in medical advocacy and patient rights." Nolan had never been inside, but he had walked past this building countless times on his way to and from the bus stop. He had noticed the name and filed it away, some instinct telling him it might matter someday. That day had apparently arrived. He climbed the narrow stairs and knocked. A voice called from inside, "It's open." The office was small, but organized, filled with file cabinets and law books that lined every wall. Behind a modest desk sat a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp with intelligence and fatigue in equal measure. She looked up from her computer and studied Nolan with the assessing gaze of someone trained to read people quickly. "Can I help you?" Clara Jennings asked. Nolan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I hope so," he said, "because I think a patient is dying at Stonewood Memorial, not because she can't recover, but because everyone has already decided she won't." Clara leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to genuine interest. "Sit down," she said, "and tell me everything." Clara Jennings listened without interruption as Nolan Curtis laid out his observations with the precision of someone accustomed to briefing under pressure. He showed her the notebook, pointing out the dates and times, the patterns he had documented, the responses that standard protocols had apparently missed or dismissed. When he finished, the small office fell into silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from the street below. Clara tapped her pen against her desk blotter, her eyes never leaving Nolan's face. "You're not a doctor," she said finally. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a dismissal either. "No, ma'am," Nolan replied. "But I was a combat medic for 12 years. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, plus other places that aren't on the official record. I held 73 different people together long enough to get them to proper medical care. And I watched 31 others die when there was nothing more I could do. I know the difference between gone and still fighting." Clara studied him for a long moment, then turned to her computer and began typing. "General Thania Foster," she said, reading from the screen. "Decorated officer, impeccable service record, currently in a persistent vegetative state following a helicopter crash 3 months ago. Medical consensus is that meaningful recovery is impossible." She looked back at Nolan. "You understand what you're suggesting? That 22 surgeons and specialists have misdiagnosed a high-profile patient. I'm suggesting they might have stopped looking too soon," Nolan said carefully. "Or that they're seeing what they expect to see rather than what's actually there. And you're seeing something different because you're the janitor who happens to have a medical background they don't know about." Clara's tone wasn't mocking, but it carried the weight of legal reality. "Mr. Curtis, I handle medical advocacy cases. I've gone up against hospitals before. It's brutal, expensive, and success usually depends on having either ironclad evidence or credible expert testimony. What you have is a janitor's notebook and observations made outside your professional capacity." Nolan had expected this. He leaned forward, choosing his words with care. "What if I told you I think there's a reason they're not looking closer? That General Foster was investigating procurement fraud before the crash, and that her waking up might be inconvenient for some very powerful people." Clara's pen stopped mid-tap. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence?" "No," Nolan admitted. "But I have questions, like why her military liaison hasn't visited in 6 weeks, or why the initial crash investigation was classified before any civilian review, or why her medical file was flagged for restricted access 3 days after she was declared vegetative." "How do you know about restricted access on her file?" Nolan hesitated, then decided honesty was the only path forward. "Because I tried to look at it in the hospital records system. My custodial credentials give me access to supply inventories and maintenance schedules. But when I searched for her name out of curiosity, I got an access denied message. That doesn't happen with regular patients." Clara was quiet for several seconds, her expression thoughtful. "You're asking me to help you challenge a major hospital's diagnosis of a 4-star general based on observations you made while mopping floors, possibly triggering an investigation into conspiracy theories about her accident, and risking your job in the process." She paused. "Did I summarize that correctly?" "Yes, ma'am." "And what exactly do you want me to do?" Nolan took a breath. "I want you to file a motion for an independent medical evaluation. There are legal frameworks for it when family members or concerned parties question a diagnosis. I've been researching the Patient Self-Determination Act, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, even military medical regulations that require periodic review of active duty personnel in long-term care." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You've done your homework." "I have a lot of time on the bus," Nolan said, "and I can't just walk away from this. I've already walked away from too many things in my life." Something in his tone made Clara's expression soften slightly. "This is personal for you," she observed. "Beyond just General Foster." Nolan looked down at his hands, calloused from cleaning supplies, and scarred from a dozen field emergencies that had left permanent marks. "My daughter is 8 years old," he said quietly. "Her name is Summer. I see her 4 hours every other weekend, supervised, because a court decided that my PTSD and my job history make me unstable. I'm fighting for partial custody, trying to prove I can be the father she deserves. But every time I walk into that courtroom, I can see the judge has already made up her mind about who I am." He met Clara's eyes. "I know what it feels like to be written off, to have people look at you and see only the limitations they've decided define you. If General Foster is in there, aware on any level, and everyone has decided she's not worth the effort of a second look, then she deserves someone who won't accept that verdict, even if that someone is just the guy who cleans her floor." The office fell silent again. Clara stood and walked to her window, looking out at the street below. When she spoke, her voice carried a different quality, softer but more resolute. "6 years ago," she said, not turning around, "my mother had a stroke. The doctors said she'd never recover meaningful function, that we should consider comfort care and prepare for the end. But I saw things, tiny things that everyone else dismissed. A squeeze of the hand, a change in breathing. I fought for more testing, more therapy, and eventually she proved them wrong. Not completely, but enough to regain speech and partial mobility. Enough to tell me she loved me one more time before she actually did pass, 2 years later." Clara turned back to face Nolan. "The system is designed to protect itself, not to admit mistakes. If we do this, if we challenge Stonewood Memorial's diagnosis, they will come at you with everything they have. Your employment, your custody case, your credibility. They will dig into every corner of your life looking for ammunition." "I understand," Nolan said. "Do you?" Clara moved back to her desk and pulled out a legal pad. "Tell me about the discharge from the military. The PTSD. The job changes. Everything the hospital's lawyers will use to paint you as unstable and unreliable." Nolan took a steadying breath. This was the part he had been avoiding, the history that followed him like a shadow, no matter how far he tried to walk into light. "The last combat deployment was different," he began. "We were embedded with a local security force, training and support. There was an ambush, poorly planned but effective. We lost 3 Americans and 7 locals in the first 90 seconds. He could feel himself slipping back into that afternoon, the smell of burning rubber and cordite, the sound of someone screaming in Pashto, the weight of a dying soldier in his arms. I kept working, doing what I was trained to do, trying to stabilize the wounded. But there was a boy, maybe 12 years old, caught in the crossfire. He wasn't part of the fight, just wrong place and wrong time. I got to him, but I was too late. He died while I was applying pressure to a wound that didn't matter because the real damage was internal." Nolan's voice remained steady, but his hands had begun to shake slightly. "After we got back to base, I couldn't stop seeing his face. Couldn't sleep without nightmares. Started having panic attacks during routine patrols. The military doctors diagnosed PTSD and recommended discharge with honors and full benefits. I agreed because I knew I was becoming a liability to my unit. But then, the benefits got lost in paperwork," Clara said, writing notes. "And the diagnosis became a weapon in your custody hearing. My ex-wife's lawyer made it sound like I was dangerous, unstable, a risk to my own daughter. The judge was sympathetic, but cautious. Better safe than sorry, she said. As if keeping me at arm's length was protecting Summer from some imaginary threat." Clara set down her pen. "And now you're working as a janitor at a hospital, essentially invisible, trying to stay close to your daughter while rebuilding credibility one mop bucket at a time. That's the summary." Nolan agreed. "And you want to throw all of that rebuilding away by challenging a hospital's medical authority, potentially triggering investigations and media attention that will put you directly in the spotlight." "Only if it means giving General Foster a chance," Nolan said. "Because if I don't, If I just walk past her room every night, knowing she might be aware and trapped and alone, then I'm not the person I told my daughter I was trying to become. Clara studied him for a long moment, then picked up her pen again. All right, she said. I'll file a preliminary motion for independent evaluation under the Patient Advocacy and Review Act. It's a long shot, but we might get a hearing. In the meantime, you need to document everything, not just what you observe, but timestamps, environmental factors, any correlation between stimulus and response. Make it scientific, not anecdotal. I can do that, Nolan said. And Mr. Curtis, Clara added, her tone serious. Prepare yourself for the possibility that you're wrong, that what you're seeing is exactly what the doctors say it is. Reflexive responses with no consciousness behind them. Because if you pursue this, and it turns out you're mistaken, the damage to your custody case could be permanent. Nolan stood, extending his hand. I appreciate the warning, but I've been wrong before, and survived it. What I can't survive is not trying. Clara shook his hand, her grip firm. Then let's see if we can wake up a general. As Nolan left the office and descended the stairs back to street level, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from the Supervised Visitation Coordinator. Reminder, visitation with Summer Curtis, scheduled for Saturday, 10 2 p.m. Location Oakmont Community Center. Please arrive 15 minutes early for check-in. Nolan stared at the message, calculating. Saturday was 4 days away. 4 days, to gather more evidence, to build a case, to prove that his instincts were more than just the desperate hope of someone who saw himself in a patient written off by the system. He pocketed his phone and started walking back toward Stonewood Memorial. His next shift didn't start for 6 hours, but he wanted to review the patterns again, to see if there were any correlations he had missed. As he walked, Nolan thought about Summer, about the way she looked at him during their visits, still trusting, despite all the ways the world had tried to teach her not to be. If he succeeded in this, if he somehow managed to prove that General Thania Foster was still present and fighting, it wouldn't directly change his custody situation. But it might change something more important, his daughter's understanding of what it meant to stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. And perhaps, in some small way, it would change his understanding of who he had become after all the things that had tried to break him. The hospital rose ahead of him. 7 stories of glass and concrete housing, hundreds of stories of survival and loss. Somewhere on the 7th floor, a woman who had led soldiers into combat now fought a different battle, silent and unseen. But not unwitnessed. Not anymore. The next 72 hours transformed Nolan Curtis from passive observer into methodical investigator. He approached the task with the same disciplined focus he had once applied to field medicine, understanding that lives often depended not on dramatic interventions, but on careful attention to detail and unwavering consistency. His shifts at Stonewood Memorial became dual-purpose operations. On the surface, he remained the invisible janitor, mopping floors and emptying waste bins with the same steady reliability that had made him unremarkable to hospital staff. But beneath that mundane exterior, he was conducting what amounted to an unauthorized clinical study, documenting every observable response from General Thania Foster with increasing precision. He invested in a small digital voice recorder, the kind students used for lectures, and began narrating his observations in real time. The recorder lived in his shirt pocket, positioned so he could activate it with a subtle motion that wouldn't draw attention. At night, back in his small apartment after Summer was asleep at her mother's house across town, Nolan would transfer these audio notes into a detailed written log, cross-referencing them with timestamps and environmental factors. Day 5, November 7th, 2000, 143 hours. Approached room 714 during routine cleaning. Overhead intercom announced code blue in East Wing. Approximately 3 seconds after announcement, observed bilateral eyelid flutter in subject. Duration: 4 seconds. Heart rate increased from 72 to 76 beats per minute according to bedside monitor. Returned to baseline within 30 seconds. Environmental factors: fluorescent lighting at standard intensity. Room temperature at 68 degrees. No other personnel present. Day 6, November 8th, 0247 7 hours. Subject exhibited finger tremor in right hand, coinciding with passing emergency vehicle siren outside building. Tremor lasted approximately 2 seconds. No corresponding change in respiratory rate. Possible auditory stimulus response, consistent with previous observations. Day 7, November 9th, 2000, 319 hours. Spoke subject's name at normal conversational volume while conducting routine cleaning. Observed subtle change in facial muscle tension around eyes and mouth. Response delayed by approximately 4 seconds from stimulus. Heart rate variance of 3 beats per minute. Response pattern suggests possible processing delay rather than pure reflex. But documentation alone wasn't enough. Clara Jennings had been clear. They needed evidence that would withstand professional scrutiny. Proof that these responses indicated consciousness rather than random neurological noise. That meant Nolan needed to establish patterns, demonstrate repeatability, and somehow record these observations in a way that couldn't be dismissed as subjective interpretation. The solution came from an unexpected source. During one of his supervised visits with Summer, held in the cheerless community room of the Oakmont Community Center under the watchful eye of a social worker named Mrs. Patterson, his daughter had shown him a science project she was working on for school. She had been studying the relationship between stimulus and response in living systems, conducting simple experiments with plants and light exposure. "See, Dad," Summer had explained with the earnest enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who had discovered something profound. "The plant can't talk or anything, but you can tell it knows the light is there, because it grows toward it. Miss Rodriguez says that's called phototropism, and it proves the plant is responding to its environment even though it doesn't have a brain like we do." The social worker had checked her watch pointedly, reminding them that their 4 hours were almost up, but Summer's explanation had planted a seed in Nolan's mind that continued to grow during the quiet bus ride back to his apartment. If plants could demonstrate awareness through measurable, repeatable responses to stimuli, couldn't the same principle apply to human consciousness? The key wasn't proving that General Foster was fully awake in the conventional sense. The key was demonstrating that she was responding to her environment in ways that indicated some level of processing, awareness, and therefore presence. The next night, Nolan came to room 714 prepared. He had borrowed a decibel meter from the hospital's maintenance department, claiming he needed to measure noise levels for a facilities report. He had also acquired a small handheld video camera, purchased used from an electronics store, with money he couldn't really afford to spend. The camera was basic, low resolution, but it had a timestamp function and could record in low light conditions. He waited until the corridor was clear, then set up the camera on a supply cart positioned to capture both General Foster and the bedside monitors. Then he began a systematic series of tests, carefully controlling variables and documenting everything. First, he established a baseline, recording 5 minutes of the General's normal state with no external stimuli beyond the ambient hospital environment. Her vital signs remained stable and unchanging, exactly as the medical charts reported. Then he introduced a controlled auditory stimulus, a consistent tone from a phone app, held at 60 decibels, approximately the volume of normal conversation. He played the tone for 10 seconds, then stopped and waited. No observable response. He repeated the test 3 more times. Still nothing, but when he switched to a different type of sound, everything changed. He had downloaded a recording of helicopter rotor sounds, the distinctive rhythmic thunder of a Black Hawk in flight. He played it at the same 60 decibel volume, and within 4 seconds, General Foster's right hand contracted slightly, her fingers curling inward against the bedsheet. Her heart rate jumped from 73 to 79 beats per minute. Nolan's own pulse accelerated as he watched the monitors. He stopped the helicopter sounds and waited for her vitals to return to baseline, which took approximately 45 seconds. Then he played the sound again. The response repeated: hand contraction, elevated heart rate, subtle facial muscle tension around the eyes. He documented 6 trials, each producing a measurable response. This wasn't random. This wasn't reflex. This was a patient reacting to a specific stimulus associated with a traumatic memory. Exactly the kind of response that indicated some form of consciousness, even if diminished or altered. Over the next week, Nolan expanded his testing protocols. He brought in other sounds, music, spoken words, ambient noise recordings. He tested at different times of day, under different lighting conditions, with varying levels of background hospital activity, and slowly, carefully, a picture emerged from the data. General Foster responded most strongly to sounds associated with military operations. Helicopter rotors, radio chatter, engine noise. She showed secondary responses to human voices, particularly female voices in the alto range. She exhibited minimal response to music or abstract sounds. The pattern suggested that whatever remained of her consciousness was anchored most firmly to her professional identity and recent traumatic experiences. Nolan compiled everything into a detailed report, complete with video timestamps, vital sign correlations, and statistical analysis that showed response rates far exceeding what chance alone would predict. He delivered the 53-page document to Clara Jennings on a Tuesday afternoon, apologizing for the length but explaining that he had tried to anticipate every possible counterargument. Clara had read through it over the course of 2 days, then called him back to her office. When Nolan arrived, he found her sitting with the report spread across her desk, pages covered in highlighter marks and marginal notes. "This is extraordinary work," Clara said, without preamble. "Methodologically sound, carefully documented, and compelling. You've essentially conducted a clinical study without any of the institutional resources typically required. Is it enough?" Nolan asked. Clara leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "It's enough to file a formal motion for independent medical evaluation. The data you've gathered establishes reasonable doubt about the current diagnosis, which is the legal threshold we need to clear. Whether it's enough to actually get a hearing and convince a judge, that's a different question." She pulled out a legal document she had been drafting. "I'm preparing a motion under the Patient Advocacy and Medical Review Act. We're arguing that General Foster's case warrants reevaluation based on new evidence of possible consciousness indicators that weren't detected during the initial diagnostic period. We'll submit your documentation as supporting evidence, along with a request for qualified expert review." "Who reviews it?" Nolan asked. "That's where things get complicated," Clara admitted. "Ideally, we'd want an independent neurologist with no ties to Stonewood Memorial. But General Foster is military, which means any official reevaluation would likely involve military medical personnel who may have their own institutional pressures. We need someone with unimpeachable credentials who's willing to challenge conventional wisdom. Do you know anyone like that?" Clara smiled slightly. "I know of someone. Dr. Brielle Douglas. She's a neuroscientist who specializes in consciousness research and disorders of awareness. She's testified in several high-profile cases involving misdiagnosis of vegetative states. She's also notoriously difficult to impress and charges consultation fees that would bankrupt most people." "How much are we talking about?" "For an initial review, probably $5,000. For testimony if it goes to a hearing, another $10,000 to $15,000. Nolan felt the air leave his lungs. He had approximately $800 in his savings account, accumulated through careful budgeting and the elimination of anything that wasn't strictly necessary. "I don't have that kind of money," he said quietly. "I know," Clara replied, "which is why I'm going to make some calls and see if Dr. Douglas might be willing to review the case pro bono or on contingency. It's a long shot, but the scientific interest alone might be enough to get her attention. Your documentation is genuinely impressive, and if she thinks there's a real discovery here, she might be willing to get involved." Nolan nodded, trying not to let hope take root too firmly. Hope was dangerous when reality had so many ways of crushing it. "What happens next?" "I file the motion tomorrow. The hospital has 2 weeks to respond. Then we'll likely get a preliminary hearing to determine if there's sufficient cause for an independent evaluation. In the meantime, you keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Document everything, stay professional, and for the love of all that's holy, don't tell anyone at the hospital what we're planning." "I haven't told anyone," Nolan assured her. "Good, because the moment they find out, they'll shut down your access to that room faster than you can imagine. Right now, you're just the janitor. The moment you become the person challenging their medical authority, you become a threat." Nolan stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Clara, can I ask you something? Why are you doing this? I can't pay your fees either. You could spend this time on cases that actually generate income." Clara was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "Because my mother died, believing that someone fought for her when everyone else had given up. That mattered to her, maybe more than the extra 2 years she got. And I've been practicing law for almost a decade, and I can tell you that justice doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes it looks like refusing to accept that someone doesn't matter just because they can't speak for themselves." She met Nolan's eyes. "Also, if I'm being completely honest, I'm really tired of institutions that protect their own interests at the expense of the people they're supposed to serve. This might be a windmill we're tilting at, but at least we're tilting." Nolan smiled despite himself. "Don Quixote references usually end badly?" "Usually," Clara agreed. "But sometimes, the windmill turns out to be an actual giant." That night, Nolan returned to Stonewood Memorial for his regular shift. As he pushed his cart past room 714, he paused briefly in the doorway. General Foster lay as she always did, still and silent beneath sterile sheets. But Nolan knew now what the monitors couldn't measure. That somewhere beneath that stillness, awareness flickered like a candle flame that refused to die. "We're fighting for you," he whispered, to the empty room. "And we're not stopping." Then, he continued down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. A janitor carrying secrets that might change everything or might amount to nothing, but the desperate hope of someone who had forgotten how to give up. The motion hit Stonewood Memorial's legal department like a grenade rolled into a quiet room. Within 48 hours of Clara Jennings filing the official petition for independent medical evaluation of General Thania Foster, the hospital's response apparatus swung into action with the coordinated precision of an institution that had plenty of experience protecting itself from external challenges. Nolan first sensed the shift during his Thursday evening shift. He arrived at the custodial office to find his supervisor, a normally easygoing man named Raymond Cole, waiting for him with an expression that suggested uncomfortable conversations were about to occur. "Nolan, we need to talk," Raymond said, gesturing toward the small office attached to the supply room. Once inside with the door closed, Raymond pulled out a printed memo on hospital letterhead. "Administration sent this down today. There's been a complaint filed about custodial staff accessing patient rooms outside of scheduled cleaning protocols." Nolan kept his expression neutral. "A complaint from who?" "Doesn't say specifically, just notes that there have been irregular access patterns in the intensive care wing, particularly around room 714. Raymond looked uncomfortable. "Look, I don't know what this is about, and honestly I don't want to know. But the directive is clear. All custodial staff are now required to log entry and exit times for any patient rooms, and cleaning schedules are being standardized. You're being reassigned from the 7th floor to the parking garage and exterior grounds, maintenance, effective immediately." The reassignment was surgical in its precision, not a termination that might suggest retaliation. Just a routine staffing adjustment that happened to remove Nolan from anywhere near General Foster's room. He couldn't protest without revealing that the reassignment mattered to him, which would only confirm whatever suspicions had already been raised. "Understood," Nolan said quietly. "When do I start the new assignment?" "Tonight," Raymond replied, relief evident in his voice at Nolan's lack of argument. "I'm sorry, man. Orders from above my pay grade." Nolan collected his new assignment sheet and headed to the parking garage, his mind already calculating the implications. Someone had noticed his attention to room 714, which meant someone was watching, which meant the Peace Hospital was preparing its defense even before the legal motion had been officially served. The speed of the response suggested that this wasn't routine bureaucratic caution. This was deliberate obstruction. He pulled out his phone and texted Clara, "They moved me off the floor. Can't access room anymore." Her response came within minutes. "Expected. They're allowed to manage staffing. Continue documentation from memory. Focus on what you've already gathered. Hearing is scheduled for next week." The following days felt like trying to fight with one arm tied behind his back. Nolan continued his shifts in the parking garage, pressure washing concrete, and maintaining equipment that didn't need his attention to function. The work was mindless, which gave him too much time to think about what he couldn't observe, about responses he might be missing, about the general lying in room 714, with no one watching for signs everyone else had decided didn't exist. His frustration grew when Clara called on Saturday morning, 3 hours before his scheduled visitation with Summer, to deliver more bad news. The hospital filed their response yesterday, Clara said, her voice tight with controlled anger. It's comprehensive and aggressive. They're not just defending the diagnosis, they're attacking the motion as frivolous and potentially harmful. They've included affidavits from all 22 surgeons who evaluated General Foster, each one stating unequivocally that she exhibits no signs of consciousness and that the original diagnosis was thorough and accurate. "What about my documentation?" Nolan asked. "They address it directly," Clara replied. "And this is where things get personal. They've included a counter-filing that questions your credibility as a witness. They cite your lack of medical credentials, your employment as custodial staff, and they've somehow obtained information about your PTSD diagnosis and your custody situation." Nolan felt ice form in his stomach. How will they get that information? Medical records are supposed to be confidential, but custody proceedings are part of the public record if you know where to look. They're arguing that your observations are the product of someone with documented psychological issues, who may be projecting his own desire to rescue his relationship with his daughter onto a patient's situation where he has no actual expertise or authority. The characterization was devastating precisely because it contained enough truth to be plausible. Nolan could imagine how it would sound to a judge. Troubled veteran with PTSD and an unstable custody situation becomes obsessed with hospital patient, sees patterns where none exist, and constructs an elaborate fantasy of rescue and redemption. "That's not what this is," Nolan said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice and hating it. "I know," Clara replied, "but they're going to make that argument, and we need to be prepared for it. The hearing is in 5 days. We need something stronger than your observations. No matter how well documented, we need expert validation." "Did Dr. Douglas agree to review the case?" "She did, and her preliminary assessment is actually encouraging. She thinks your documentation shows possible indicators of covert consciousness, which is a real phenomenon in some patients diagnosed as vegetative. But she wants to conduct her own evaluation before she'll testify. The problem is that the hospital is now refusing to grant her access to General Foster." "Can they do that?" "They're arguing that any additional stimulation or evaluation could be harmful to the patient, and that allowing unvetted outside researchers to conduct tests would violate their duty of care. It's a defensible position legally, even if it's transparently self-serving." Nolan paced his small apartment, phone pressed to his ear. "So we're blocked from gathering any new evidence. They're attacking my credibility, and we have a hearing in 5 days where we need to convince a judge to overrule 22 surgeons based on documentation from someone they're painting as an unstable janitor with a savior complex." "That's an accurate summary of our current position," Clara admitted. "I'm not going to lie to you, Nolan. This is going to be difficult. The system is designed to give enormous deference to medical expertise, and challenging that expertise requires either compelling counter-expertise or evidence so overwhelming that it can't be dismissed. Right now, we have neither." After the call ended, Nolan sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall of his apartment, where he had pinned a drawing Summer had made during their last visit. It showed two stick figures, holding hands under a smiling sun, labeled in careful print, "Me and Daddy." He thought about giving up, about accepting that he had tried and failed, about returning to the comfortable invisibility of someone who mopped floors and didn't challenge systems. He couldn't change. It would be easier. It would be safer for his custody case. It would be the rational choice. But then, he thought about General Thania Foster, lying in room 714, possibly aware on some level that she had been written off and abandoned. He thought about his daughter, who would someday face her own battles against people who underestimated her or decided she didn't matter. And he thought about who he wanted to be when he looked at himself in the mirror. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday afternoon in a courtroom that felt more like a conference room, deliberately informal to emphasize that this was an administrative proceeding rather than a criminal trial. But the stakes felt no less significant as Nolan sat beside Clara, at a plain table facing a judge's bench occupied by the Honorable Lydia Hunt, a family court judge who had been assigned to hear medical advocacy motions. Across the aisle sat 3 attorneys representing Stonewood Memorial, their table covered with binders and legal documents that seemed designed to physically manifest the weight of institutional authority. Behind them sat Dr. Seth Newman, the hospital's chief of neurology, whose expression suggested that being questioned about his professional judgment was an affront he intended to remember. Judge Hunt reviewed the filings in silence for several minutes before looking up. "This is a motion for independent medical evaluation based on alleged new evidence of consciousness indicators in a patient currently diagnosed as persistently vegetative. Miss Jennings, you represent the petitioner?" "Yes, Your Honor." Clara stood. "We're seeking authorization for an independent neurological assessment by Dr. Brielle Douglas, a recognized expert in disorders of consciousness. The evidence gathered by my client suggests that General Foster may be exhibiting signs of awareness that weren't detected during the initial diagnostic period. Your client being Mr. Curtis, who works in custodial services at Stonewood Memorial?" "That's correct, Your Honor." Mr. Curtis is also a former combat medic with 12 years of military service and extensive training in emergency medicine and trauma response. One of the hospital's attorneys, a sharp-featured woman named Victoria Walsh, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, if I may address the court on behalf of Stonewood Memorial. We believe this motion lacks merit and should be dismissed. General Foster was evaluated by a team of highly qualified specialists using the most advanced diagnostic tools available. The diagnosis of persistent vegetative state was not made lightly or quickly. It was the result of comprehensive testing over several weeks by physicians whose expertise is beyond question. And yet Mr. Curtis observed responses he believes indicate consciousness." Judge Hunt noted, looking at Nolan directly for the first time. "Mr. Curtis, would you explain what you observed and why you believe it contradicts the medical diagnosis?" Nolan stood, his heart hammering but his voice steady. "Your Honor, during the course of my work, I had the opportunity to observe General Foster regularly. I noticed subtle responses to specific stimuli, particularly sounds associated with her military service. These weren't random movements. They were patterned, repeatable, and correlated with changes in her vital signs. As someone with medical training, I recognized these as possible indicators of awareness, even if diminished." Dr. Newman leaned forward to whisper something to the hospital's attorneys. Victoria Walsh nodded and stood again. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit the affidavits from the 22 specialists who evaluated General Foster. Each one confirms that any movements or responses observed are consistent with reflexive activity in vegetative states and do not indicate consciousness. We'd also like to point out that Mr. Curtis's observations were made in an unauthorized capacity, without controlled conditions or proper medical oversight. The fact that they were made by someone who isn't part of the medical establishment doesn't make them invalid," Clara countered. "In fact, it may explain why these signs were noticed at all." Mr. Curtis had the time and attention to observe patterns that busy medical staff might miss during brief evaluations. Or, it explains why someone without proper training might misinterpret normal reflexive responses as meaningful activity. Victoria Walsh shot back. Your Honor, we're also concerned about Mr. Curtis's personal circumstances, his history of PTSD, his ongoing custody disputes, his employment in a position far below his claimed qualifications. All of these factors raise questions about his reliability as a witness and his motivations in pursuing this matter. Nolan felt the familiar shame rising, the sense that his entire history was being used as evidence, that he couldn't be trusted to perceive reality accurately. But before he could respond, Judge Hunt raised her hand. Miss Walsh, I'll thank you not to engage in character assassination in my courtroom. Mr. Curtis's personal circumstances are not on trial here. The question before me is whether there is sufficient evidence to warrant an independent evaluation, not whether Mr. Curtis fits your definition of a credible witness. She turned to Clara. That said, Miss Jennings, the burden is on you to demonstrate that an independent evaluation is warranted. What expert testimony can you provide to support your client's observations? Clara stood. Your Honor, Dr. Brielle Douglas has reviewed Mr. Curtis's documentation and believes it shows potential indicators of covert consciousness. She's prepared to testify to that effect if granted access to evaluate General Foster directly. The hospital has refused that access, correct? Yes, Your Honor, on the grounds that it might be harmful to the patient. Judge Hunt looked at the hospital's attorneys. Is that your position? Victoria Walsh nodded. We have a duty of care to General Foster. Subjecting her to additional testing by outside parties without clear medical necessity could constitute harm, particularly if those tests are based on flawed premises. The judge was quiet for a long moment, reviewing documents. Finally, she looked up. Here's my concern. If Mr. Curtis is correct, if there are signs of consciousness that have been missed, then General Foster is being denied appropriate treatment and potentially suffering in ways we can't measure. That's a serious harm. But if Mr. Curtis is wrong, then we're second-guessing a comprehensive medical evaluation based on observations made by someone without credentials in a non-clinical capacity. That sets a problematic precedent. She paused, then continued. I'm going to order a compromise. The hospital will allow Dr. Douglas to conduct a limited evaluation, supervised by hospital staff, using non-invasive methods only. If that evaluation produces findings consistent with Mr. Curtis's observations, we'll reconvene to discuss next steps. If it doesn't, this matter is closed. Do both parties understand? Clara and the hospital attorneys both indicated their agreement, though neither looked entirely satisfied. As the hearing concluded and people began filing out, Nolan felt both relief and trepidation. They had gotten a chance, but it was narrow and conditional. Everything now depended on whether Dr. Douglas could find in one controlled evaluation what Nolan had observed over weeks of careful attention. As he left the courthouse, Nolan's phone buzzed with a text from the supervised visitation coordinator. Visit with Summer Curtis canceled this week per mother's request. Rescheduled pending review. The message was brief, but its implications were clear. His ex-wife had heard about the hearing, about his challenge to the hospital, and she was responding by limiting his access to his daughter. The system was closing ranks, protecting itself from someone who had dared to question its authority. Nolan stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it and put his phone away. He had known this might happen, had understood that standing up would come with costs. The only question now was whether those costs would purchase anything meaningful, or simply confirm that some battles couldn't be won by people who pushed mop buckets for a living. The answer would come in 3 days, when Dr. Brielle Douglas arrived at Stonewood Memorial to conduct her evaluation. Until then, all Nolan could do was wait and hope that he hadn't imagined signs of life, where there was only the echo of his own desperate need to believe in second chances. Dr. Brielle Douglas arrived at Stonewood Memorial Hospital on a gray Tuesday morning that matched the institutional pallor of the building itself. She was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that suggested she had seen enough medical mysteries to maintain healthy skepticism about both confident diagnoses and dramatic claims of miracle recoveries. Nolan watched from a distance as she entered through the main doors, accompanied by Clara Jennings, and flanked immediately by hospital administrators, who had clearly been briefed to maintain strict control over her access and activities. He wasn't supposed to be there. His shift didn't start for another 4 hours, but he had come anyway, unable to stay away from what might be either vindication or the final collapse of everything he had been fighting for. The evaluation was scheduled to take place over 2 hours in room 714, with Dr. Newman and 2 other hospital neurologists present to observe. Nolan had not been invited to attend, a deliberate exclusion that everyone understood was designed to keep him from influencing the results or interpreting responses in ways that confirmed his existing beliefs. Clara had texted him the night before, "You did your part. Now we have to trust that the truth speaks for itself." Easy to say, harder to believe when you weren't the one who had spent weeks watching for signs everyone else dismissed as neurological noise. Nolan tried to distract himself by walking the hospital's exterior grounds, checking equipment that didn't need checking, but his mind remained fixed on room 714 and what was happening behind its closed door. He imagined Dr. Douglas conducting her tests with clinical precision, running through protocols designed to detect awareness in patients who appeared absent. He imagined General Foster, trapped in whatever diminished state of consciousness she occupied, trying to respond to stimuli while doctors watched and measured and interpreted through frameworks that might not accommodate her particular form of presence. 2 hours felt like 2 days. When Nolan's phone finally buzzed with a text from Clara, his hands shook as he pulled it from his pocket. "Evaluation complete. Meet me at my office in 1 hour." The message gave no indication of results, no hint of which direction the wind was blowing. Nolan spent the intervening time on the bus into town, staring out the window at passing streets, while his mind cycled through possibilities. Dr. Douglas had found evidence supporting his observations. Dr. Douglas had found nothing, and he was about to learn he had been mistaken all along. Dr. Douglas had found something ambiguous that would require additional testing and prolong the uncertainty indefinitely. When he arrived at Clara's office, he found her sitting behind her desk with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Dr. Douglas sat in one of the client chairs, reviewing notes on a tablet. Both women looked up as he entered. "Mr. Curtis," Dr. Douglas said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for your documentation. It was remarkably thorough for someone without formal neurological training." "Thank you," Nolan replied, trying to interpret whether the compliment carried any implications about her findings. "Were you able to evaluate General Foster?" "I was," Dr. Douglas said, settling back into her chair. "Under less than ideal circumstances, I should note, the hospital insisted on maintaining their own monitoring protocols and limited my testing to what they considered non-invasive stimulation. But within those constraints, I was able to conduct a meaningful evaluation." She paused, and Nolan felt his heart hammering in the silence. Clara's expression remained carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Mr. Curtis," Dr. Douglas continued, "have you heard of covert consciousness or cognitive motor dissociation?" "I've read about it," Nolan said. "It's when patients show brain activity indicating awareness but can't produce the physical responses that standard consciousness assessments look for." "Exactly. It's a condition we've only recently begun to understand, where the pathways between thought and action are disrupted in ways that make patients appear more impaired than they actually are. Standard bedside evaluations often miss these patients entirely because they're looking for obvious responses like following commands or making purposeful movements." Dr. Douglas turned her tablet to show Nolan a series of brain scan images. "What you're looking at are functional MRI results from General Foster's evaluation this morning. The hospital hadn't conducted any functional imaging since the initial diagnostic period. They'd been relying on structural scans and EEG monitoring. But when we used fMRI, observe her brain activity while presenting various stimuli, we found something remarkable. She pointed to areas of the scans that showed bright patches of activity. This is her auditory cortex responding to sounds. This is her motor cortex showing activation when I asked her to imagine moving her right hand, even though her hand didn't actually move. And this, she highlighted another region, is her prefrontal cortex, the area associated with conscious thought and decision-making. All of this activity indicates that General Foster is significantly more aware than her diagnosis suggests. Nolan felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying for so long that its absence felt almost disorienting. "So I wasn't wrong," he said quietly. "You weren't wrong," Dr. Douglas confirmed. "The responses you documented, the patterns you noticed, they were real. You were observing external manifestations of internal awareness that the standard diagnostic protocols failed to detect. It's not uncommon, unfortunately. Studies suggest that up to 15% of patients diagnosed as vegetative may actually have some level of consciousness. We just don't test for it properly." Clara leaned forward. "Dr. Douglas, will you testify to these findings in a formal hearing?" "I will," Dr. Douglas replied. "And more than that, I'm going to recommend an immediate change in General Foster's treatment plan. She should be transferred to a facility specializing in rehabilitation for patients with disorders of consciousness. With proper therapy, there's a reasonable chance she could recover meaningful function, possibly even full communication ability. The hospital is going to fight that recommendation," Clara said. "They've invested considerable resources in defending their original diagnosis." Dr. Douglas's expression hardened slightly. "Then they're prioritizing their institutional reputation over their patients' welfare, which should concern the medical board considerably. I've already notified the Military Medical Liaison Office about my findings. General Foster is still an active duty officer, which means the military has oversight authority. I expect they'll be very interested in why one of their highest-ranking personnel has been receiving substandard care." The implications rippled outward from that statement like waves from a stone dropped in still water. A military investigation into Stonewood Memorial's treatment protocols. A formal review of how the diagnosis had been made and maintained. Potential liability exposure that would make the hospital's legal team deeply uncomfortable. And at the center of it all, a janitor who had refused to accept that someone didn't matter just because doctors said she was beyond reach. Over the next week, events moved with the accelerating momentum of a system that had been destabilized and was now searching for a new equilibrium. The Military Medical Liaison Office sent a team to review General Foster's case. The hospital's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Dr. Newman submitted a defensive report attempting to explain why his team's evaluation had missed signs of consciousness, arguing that the protocols they had followed were standard and that hindsight made everything clearer. But the clearest sign that something fundamental had shifted came when Nolan received a call from an unknown number on Thursday evening. He answered hesitantly, expecting a telemarketer. "Mr. Curtis?" The voice was female, professional, with an accent that suggested East Coast boarding schools and Ivy League education. "This is Colonel Amber Maxwell, Military Medical Liaison for General Foster's case. I wanted to thank you personally for your advocacy on behalf of the General." Nolan was momentarily speechless. "I just did what anyone should have done," he finally managed. "That's demonstrably untrue," Colonel Maxwell replied with dry humor. 22 specialists didn't do it. An ATNAT, entire hospital staff, didn't do it. You did it, despite having every incentive not to. The General is being transferred tomorrow to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where she'll receive specialized rehabilitation. I wanted you to know that before it becomes public. Will she recover? Nolan asked. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. Dr. Douglas believes that with intensive therapy, General Foster may regain significant function. It will take time, possibly months or years, but the fact that we're even having this conversation is because of your refusal to accept a convenient diagnosis. Colonel Maxwell paused. I understand you faced some professional and personal difficulties as a result of challenging the hospital. Some, Nolan admitted, thinking about the canceled visitations with Summer, the reassignment to the parking garage, the way hospital staff now looked at him with a mixture of resentment and uncomfortable respect. The military doesn't forget its debts, Mr. Curtis. General Foster was investigating procurement fraud when her helicopter went down. There are people who had reasons to want her silenced, and your actions may have prevented a successful erasure of an officer who was asking inconvenient questions. Once she's able to communicate again, I expect some very interesting conversations will occur. After the call ended, Nolan sat in his apartment feeling the strange emotional vertigo of victory mixed with exhaustion. He had been right. General Foster had been aware. His observations had been valid, but validation came with its own complications, its own weight of responsibility and consequence. His phone buzzed with a text from Clara, major media picking up the story. Hospital releasing statement. You should prepare for attention. Nolan stared at the message, then looked around his modest apartment with its second-hand furniture and walls that had never quite felt like home. He thought about Summer, about the supervised visitation that had been canceled, about the custody battle that was about to become even more complex, now that he was no longer just a janitor with PTSD, but a janitor with PTSD who had somehow been right when everyone else was wrong. He wasn't sure if that made things better or worse, but as he looked at his daughter's drawing still pinned to the wall, the stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun, Nolan knew that regardless of what came next, he had done something that mattered. He had seen someone who needed to be seen. He had refused to walk past suffering just because it was convenient to do so, and maybe, in some small way, that made him the father he had been trying to become all along. The news coverage started locally, but spread with the viral velocity of stories that touched something fundamental in the public consciousness. A janitor who saw what doctors missed. A decorated general left to languish until the lowest person in the hospital hierarchy refused to look away. The narrative was too perfect, too aligned with cultural anxieties about medical systems and institutional blindness, for media outlets to resist. By Friday morning, Nolan's phone was flooded with calls from reporters, producers, and morning show bookers. He ignored most of them, but the sheer volume made it impossible to pretend his life hadn't been fundamentally altered. When he arrived for his shift at Stonewood Memorial, a news van was parked near the employee entrance, and a reporter approached him with a microphone before he could reach the door. Mr. Curtis, can you tell us how it feels to have saved General Foster's life when 22 surgeons said she was beyond help? Nolan kept walking, his head down. No comment. Is it true you're fighting for custody of your daughter? Will this change the court's decision? He pushed through the door without responding, but the question burrowed into his mind like a splinter. Would this change anything? Or would it simply provide new ammunition for his ex-wife's attorneys to paint him as someone who courted attention and conflict? Inside, the atmosphere had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Other custodial staff looked at him differently now, some with admiration, others with the resentment of people who felt his actions had made their own invisibility more pointed. The nursing staff who had once ignored him now offered tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and the administrative personnel moved through hallways with the rigid posture of people waiting for the next shoe to drop. Raymond Cole pulled him aside before he could clock in. Nolan, I need you to understand something. The hospital is in full damage control mode. They're conducting an internal review of diagnostic protocols, and legal is preparing for potential liability exposure. You're at the center of all of it, which makes you both valuable and dangerous. What does that mean practically? Nolan asked. It means they can't fire you without it looking like retaliation, but they can't embrace you without admitting they were wrong. So you're in limbo, and everyone who interacts with you knows that what they say might end up in a deposition. Raymond's expression was sympathetic but firm. My advice? Keep your head down, do your work, and don't talk to anyone about the case. Not staff, not patients, and definitely not media. Nolan nodded, understanding the wisdom, even as he chafed against the isolation it implied. He had spent most of his adult life trying to become invisible, and now that visibility had been forced upon him, the exposure felt like standing naked in a spotlight, every flaw and vulnerability illuminated for examination. His shift passed in uncomfortable awareness. He cleaned the parking garage with meticulous attention, finding comfort in the mindless physicality of labor. But his thoughts kept drifting to room 714, now empty since General Foster's transfer. He wondered if she was conscious during the move, if some part of her understood that she was finally receiving the care she deserved, if she would ever know that a janitor she had never met had refused to accept her erasure. During his lunch break, Nolan sat in his car and finally returned one of the many calls that had been flooding his phone. Clara Jennings answered on the first ring. "How are you holding up?" she asked without preamble. "I've been better," Nolan admitted. "The hospital is treating me like a bomb that might explode. And my ex-wife's attorney has already filed a motion to suspend my visitation rights pending a psychological evaluation." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid of that. They're going to argue that this entire situation demonstrates poor judgment and an obsessive personality. The fact that you were right doesn't change their narrative that your behavior was concerning. So what do I do? You cooperate fully with any evaluation they request. You demonstrate that you're stable, rational, and that your advocacy for General Foster came from legitimate medical observations, not psychological compulsion. And you let me handle the legal arguments." Clara paused. "Nolan, I know this feels like punishment for doing the right thing, but custody cases are always about demonstrating reliability and sound judgment over time. This is a setback, but it's not the end." After the call, Nolan sat staring through his windshield at the concrete pillars of the parking garage. He had known there would be costs to challenging the hospital. He had accepted that reality when he first walked into Clara's office. But knowing something intellectually and living through its emotional weight were entirely different experiences. His phone rang again, this time from an unfamiliar number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Mr. Curtis, this is Major Sarah Chen from Walter Reed Medical Center. I'm calling with a message from General Foster." Nolan's grip tightened on the phone. "She's awake? She can communicate?" "Not verbally yet, but we've established a communication system using eye movements and a letter board. It's slow, but functional. This morning, one of the first things she spelled out was a question. Who found me? When we told her about your advocacy, she asked us to thank you." Major Chen's voice carried genuine warmth. "She wanted you to know that she was aware, at least partially, during her time at Stonewood Memorial. She says she remembers someone speaking to her, telling her she wasn't alone." "Was that you?" Nolan felt his throat tighten. "Yes. I didn't know if she could hear me." "She heard you. And she wants you to know it mattered." Major Chen paused. "General Foster is a remarkable woman, Mr. Curtis. She's already asking about the investigation into her helicopter crash and the procurement fraud she was examining. The doctors are trying to get her to focus on recovery, but she's insisting on debriefing military intelligence. I thought you should know that the person you fought for is every bit as strong as her record suggests." After the call ended, Nolan sat in his car for a long time, processing emotions he couldn't quite name. Relief that he had been right. Validation that his observations had been real, but also something deeper, a sense of connection to another person's struggle that transcended the circumstances that had brought them into each other's orbits. He thought about General Foster, lying in that hospital bed, aware but trapped, listening to doctors discuss her case as if she were already gone. The isolation of that experience, the horror of being present but erased, must have been beyond anything he could truly comprehend. And somehow, his voice had reached her in that darkness, had told her that someone was still looking, still seeing, still refusing to accept her disappearance. When Nolan returned home that evening, he found an envelope that had been slipped under his door. Inside was a handwritten note on legal stationery from his ex-wife's attorney, informing him that all visitation with Summer was suspended until the completion of a court-ordered psychological evaluation. The appointment was scheduled for 2 weeks out, with a specialist who worked frequently with the family court system. Nolan read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in the growing file of custody documents that represented his ongoing battle to remain part of his daughter's life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had fought to prove that a patient everyone else had written off was still present and deserving of care, but he couldn't convince a court that he was stable enough to spend unsupervised time with his own child. That night, he lay awake in the darkness of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the city filtering through his thin walls. His mind kept returning to a moment during his last visit with Summer, before everything had escalated. She had asked him why he worked at the hospital, and he had told her it was because he wanted to help people, even if his help looked different than it used to. Summer had considered this with the seriousness that 8-year-olds bring to questions that matter. Then she had said, "Mom says you can't help people anymore because you're too sad, but I don't think that's true. I think you just help people differently now." The memory brought tears that Nolan didn't try to stop. His daughter saw him more clearly than any court evaluation ever would. She understood that his worth wasn't measured by his job title or his diagnosis, but by his willingness to show up and care when it would have been easier not to. He just wished that understanding was enough to keep her in his life. The psychological evaluation took place in a sterile office that smelled of air freshener and anxiety. Dr. Patricia Oakes was a woman in her 60s who specialized in custody evaluations, her credentials covering an entire wall in frames that testified to decades of determining which parents were fit and which were risks. She greeted Nolan with professional warmth that felt rehearsed, gesturing him toward a chair that was deliberately positioned to be slightly uncomfortable. "Mr. Curtis, I've reviewed your file and the recent events at Stonewood Memorial. I'd like to spend today talking about your decision-making process and your current mental state." Dr. Oakes settled into her own chair with a legal pad balanced on her knee. "Let's start with your PTSD diagnosis. Can you tell me about your symptoms and how you manage them?" The questions came in waves, each one carefully crafted to probe for instability, obsessive tendencies, or judgment failures. Nolan answered with the honesty of someone who had learned that evasion only made things worse. Yes, he still had nightmares about his combat deployments. Yes, he sometimes experienced hypervigilance in crowded spaces. Yes, he had sought therapy after his discharge and continued to use coping techniques he had learned. And the situation with General Foster, Dr. Oakes said, her pen poised above her notepad. "Your ex-wife's attorney suggests that your focus on this patient represented a manifestation of rescue fantasies related to your own feeling of powerlessness regarding your daughter. How would you respond to that characterization?" Nolan had prepared for this question, but preparation didn't make it easier to answer without defensiveness creeping into his voice. "I observed medical signs that indicated a patient might be more aware than her diagnosis suggested. I documented those observations and sought legal counsel about the appropriate next steps. My advocacy was based on clinical observations, not psychological projection. But you must understand how it appears." Dr. Oakes pressed gently. "A man who feels he's lost access to his daughter becomes fixated on saving a patient who can't speak for herself. The parallel is quite striking." "The parallel exists," Nolan acknowledged. "But that doesn't invalidate my observations. General Foster is receiving appropriate care now because I refused to dismiss what I was seeing. The fact that my personal circumstances made me sensitive to someone being overlooked doesn't mean I was wrong about what I observed." Dr. Oakes made notes that Nolan couldn't read from his angle. "Tell me about Summer. What kind of father do you think you are?" The question shifted something in Nolan's chest. "I think I'm a father who's made mistakes, but loves his daughter completely. I think I'm someone who's working every day to be better than I was yesterday. And I think Summer deserves a father who shows her that doing the right thing matters, even when it's difficult or costly." "And you believe that challenging a hospital's medical judgment, despite having no formal authority to do so, demonstrates doing the right thing. I believe that refusing to ignore someone's suffering demonstrates doing the right thing. Yes. The evaluation continued for another 90 minutes, covering everything from his employment history, to his social support network, to his plans for future stability. By the time Nolan left the office, he felt wrung out, every vulnerability he possessed having been examined and cataloged for a report that would help determine his future relationship with his daughter. Walking to the bus stop, his phone buzzed with a call from Colonel Maxwell, the military liaison officer. "Mr. Curtis, I wanted to update you on General Foster's condition. She's making remarkable progress. We've moved beyond the letterboard to a computerized communication system that tracks eye movements. She's able to form complete sentences now, and she's been asking about you." Nolan felt something warm spread through his chest. What did she ask? "She wants to meet you when she's able to receive visitors beyond immediate family and military personnel. She's expressed that she owes you a debt she doesn't know how to repay." Colonel Maxwell paused. "She's also been providing testimony about the procurement fraud investigation. It appears her helicopter crash may not have been accidental. There are some very powerful people who are extremely uncomfortable with her recovery." The implications settled over Nolan like a weight. "Is she safe?" "She's at Walter Reed under military protection. She's as safe as we can make her. But Mr. Curtis, you should be aware that by helping her, you may have made yourself a person of interest to people who prefer their crimes stay buried. I'm not trying to frighten you, but you should be cautious about who you speak with and what information you share." After the call ended, Nolan stood at the bus stop feeling the strangeness of his new reality. A month ago, he had been invisible, a janitor whose biggest concern was maintaining steady employment and earning back visitation time with his daughter. Now, he was somehow entangled in military investigations, media attention, and custody evaluations that would determine the shape of his future. The bus arrived, and Nolan climbed aboard, finding a seat near the back. As the city rolled past his window, he thought about the unexpected ways lives intersected, how a decision to pay attention to subtle signs in a patient's room had cascaded into consequences he could never have predicted. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Clara. "Custody hearing moved up to next week. Judge wants to address the situation quickly given media attention. We need to meet tomorrow to prepare." Nolan typed back his confirmation, then leaned his head against the window. Everything was accelerating, converging towards some resolution that would either restore pieces of what he had lost or confirm that the cost of being right was higher than he could afford to pay. That evening, Nolan received an unexpected email. The sender was listed as T. Foster at military.mil, and the subject line read simply, "Thank you." His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Mr. Curtis, I am writing this with the assistance of specialized software that translates my eye movements into text. So please forgive any awkwardness in phrasing. I am still relearning how to communicate after months of silence. Colonel Maxwell tells me you were the person who noticed I was still present when everyone else had decided I was gone. She tells me you documented observations and fought for an independent evaluation despite having no authority or institutional support. She tells me you did this knowing it might cost you professionally and personally. I want you to understand what those months were like. I was aware, at least partially. For most of my time at Stonewood Memorial, I could hear conversations, feel the passage of time, experience the profound isolation of being treated as an object rather than a person. I tried to signal, tried to move or respond in ways that would indicate presence. But nothing I did seemed to register as meaningful to the medical staff. Then, one night, someone spoke to me differently. A voice I didn't recognize told me I wasn't alone. That someone was still watching. I didn't know who you were or why you cared, but that moment of being seen, of being acknowledged as a person who might still be present, gave me something to hold on to in the darkness. You saved my life, Mr. Curtis. Not in the dramatic way that makes for good stories, but in the more fundamental way of refusing to accept my erasure. You saw me when I desperately needed to be seen, and you fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. I understand you are facing difficulties in your personal life as a result of your advocacy. If there is anything I can do to help, any testimony or support I can provide, please don't hesitate to ask. You gave me my voice back. The least I can do is use it on your behalf. With profound gratitude, General Thania Foster Nolan read the email 3 times, each reading bringing fresh emotions to the surface. He had spent so long feeling powerless, so many months, believing that his ability to help others had been stripped away along with his military medical credentials. But here was proof that his actions had mattered, that his refusal to look away had given someone hope in their darkest moment. He saved the email and sat in the quiet of his apartment, allowing himself to feel something he had almost forgotten: pride in who he was and what he stood for, regardless of job titles or court decisions or institutional hierarchies that tried to define his worth. Tomorrow he would meet with Clara to prepare for the custody hearing. Next week he would stand before a judge and argue that he deserved to be part of his daughter's life. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., a general he had never met was relearning how to speak, in part because he had refused to stay silent. The story wasn't over, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, Nolan felt like it might have a chance of ending well. The courthouse was smaller than Nolan remembered, though perhaps it only felt that way because the stakes had grown so much larger. He sat beside Clara in a conference room adjacent to the courtroom, reviewing testimony one final time while his ex-wife Rachel and her attorney occupied a similar room down the hall. The custody hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and the clock on the wall seemed to be moving both too fast and too slowly. "Remember," Clara said, keeping her voice low and steady. "Judge Martinez has read all the materials, including the psychological evaluation and the statements from Walter Reed about General Foster's case. She's going to be looking for evidence of stability and sound judgment. Don't get defensive, don't over-explain, and if you don't know an answer, say so." Nolan nodded, his throat tight, with the kind of anxiety that came from knowing that the next few hours would determine whether he remained a meaningful presence in his daughter's life or became a supervised visitor, relegated to the margins. At precisely 2 o'clock, they were called into the courtroom. Judge Elena Martinez presided from the bench, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for cutting through manipulation and deflection. Rachel sat across the aisle with her attorney, and for a brief moment, Nolan's eyes met hers. He saw anxiety there, but also something else that might have been regret or might have been nothing more than his own wishful projection. "We're here to address the petition for modification of custody arrangements regarding Summer Curtis," Judge Martinez began, looking between both parties. "I've reviewed the extensive filings, including recent events at Stonewood Memorial Hospital and the psychological evaluation of Mr. Curtis. Miss Jennings, you represent the father?" Clara stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We're seeking restoration of the visitation schedule that was in place prior to the recent suspension, with an eventual goal of expanding to unsupervised visitation and potentially joint custody as Mr. Curtis continues to demonstrate stability." Rachel's attorney, a polished man named David Brennan, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, we believe the suspension should remain in place. Recent events have demonstrated that Mr. Dashendeka Curtis exhibits poor judgment and obsessive behavior patterns that raise serious concerns about his ability to provide appropriate care for an 8-year-old child." The recent events, Clara countered, demonstrated that Mr. Curtis correctly identified a misdiagnosis that 22 specialists missed, likely saving a patient's life. "That's not poor judgment, Your Honor. That's competence and compassion." Judge Martinez raised a hand. "I'm less interested in debating the merits of the Stonewood Memorial case than I am in understanding what it tells us about Mr. Curtis's current functioning and his ability to parent effectively. Mr. Brennan, you've argued that Mr. Curtis's actions indicate obsessive tendencies. Can you elaborate?" David Brennan pulled out a folder thick with documentation. "Your Honor, Mr. Curtis became fixated on a patient he had no medical responsibility for, spent weeks conducting unauthorized observations, and ultimately challenged a major hospital's medical judgment despite working in a custodial capacity. The psychological evaluation noted that Mr. Curtis has difficulty accepting authority and tends towards single-minded focus that could be concerning in a parenting context. The evaluation also noted, Clara interjected, that Mr. Curtis shows no signs of current psychological instability, that his PTSD is well managed, and that his advocacy for General Foster was based on legitimate medical observations documented with scientific rigor. Being thorough and refusing to ignore suffering are not character flaws, Your Honor. Judge Martinez turned her attention to Nolan. Mr. Curtis, I'd like to hear from you directly. Why did you pursue this matter with General Foster when you knew it might jeopardize your custody situation? Nolan stood, his hands clasped to keep them from shaking. Your Honor, I'm a father. Every decision I make is filtered through the question of what kind of person I want my daughter to see when she looks at me. If I had walked past that patient room every night knowing she might be aware and suffering, knowing I had the medical training to recognize signs everyone else was missing, and I did nothing because it was safer for me personally, what would that teach Summer about doing the right thing? He took a breath before continuing. I understand that my advocacy created complications. I understand that challenging institutional authority looks concerning on paper. But I also know that sometimes the most important thing a parent can teach a child is that some things matter more than personal convenience or safety. Standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, that's one of those things. Judge Martinez made notes, her expression giving nothing away. And if I restored your visitation rights, if I eventually granted unsupervised access, how would you handle situations where Summer's needs conflict with other obligations or interests? My daughter comes first, Nolan said without hesitation. Always. The situation with General Foster happened during my work hours and didn't interfere with my scheduled time with Summer. If anything, I hope that what she learns from this situation is that her father is someone who pays attention, who doesn't ignore suffering, and who fights for what's right even when it's difficult. Rachel's attorney stood again. Your Honor, Mr. Curtis claims his daughter comes first, but his actions have resulted in media attention, potential threats from people implicated in General Foster's case, and ongoing legal complications. Is that the stable environment a child needs? The media attention was not something I sought, Nolan responded, looking directly at the judge. And I've taken precautions regarding safety based on guidance from military investigators. But respectfully, Your Honor, I think we need to distinguish between stability and stagnation. I'm not the same person I was when this custody arrangement was first established. I've worked consistently for over a year, maintained appropriate housing, completed therapy, and demonstrated that I can handle complex responsibilities with sound judgment. The General Foster case doesn't undermine that, it confirms it. Judge Martinez was quiet for a long moment, reviewing documents on her desk. Finally, she looked up, her gaze moving between Nolan and Rachel. I'm going to say something that may be uncomfortable for both of you to hear. This court's primary concern is Summer's well-being, not either parent's vindication or protection. And from everything I've seen, Summer has two parents who love her and want what's best for her, but who have very different ideas about what that means. She turned to Rachel. Mrs. Curtis, your concerns about your ex-husband's stability are not unreasonable given his history. But the evidence suggests that Mr. Curtis has been working diligently to address his challenges and has demonstrated sound judgment in a complex situation. Continuing to restrict his access based on fears, rather than current evidence, may do more harm than good to Summer's relationship with her father. Then she turned to Nolan. Mr. Curtis, your advocacy for General Foster speaks well of your character and your medical instincts, but you need to understand that being right doesn't erase the fact that your actions had consequences that affected more than just yourself. Going forward, As you seek increased custody time, you'll need to demonstrate that you can balance your principles with practical consideration for how your choices impact your daughter. Judge Martinez picked up her gavel. I'm ordering the immediate restoration of the previously established visitation schedule, 4 hours every other weekend under supervision. However, I'm also ordering a trial period of monthly 4-hour unsupervised visits, beginning 1 month from today, to be evaluated after 3 months. If those visits go well, we'll reconvene to discuss expanded custody arrangements. She looked directly at Nolan. Mr. Curtis, you've been given an opportunity to prove that your judgment and stability extend beyond crisis situations into the daily work of parenting. Don't waste it. I won't. Your Honor, Nolan said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to contain. As they filed out of the courtroom, Clara put a hand on Nolan's shoulder. It's not everything we wanted, but it's progress. Real, meaningful progress. Nolan nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. In the hallway, Rachel approached him hesitantly, her attorney having stepped away to take a phone call. Nolan, she said quietly, I need you to understand that I never wanted to keep Summer from you. I was scared. You were struggling, and I didn't know how to help, and protecting her felt like the only thing I could control. I know, Nolan said, meaning it, and I'm sorry I gave you reasons to be scared. I'm working on being better, being more stable. For her. Rachel nodded, something in her expression softening. What you did at the hospital, standing up for that patient, Summer heard about it at school. Some of the kids' parents had seen the news. She came home so proud, Nolan. She told everyone her dad was a hero who saved a general's life. The information hit Nolan with unexpected force. She said that? She did. And I realized that maybe I've been so focused on protecting her from your struggles that I forgot to let her see your strengths. Rachel took a breath. I'm not going to fight the unsupervised visits. If the judge thinks you're ready, then I'm willing to trust that process. After Rachel walked away, Nolan stood in the courthouse hallway, feeling the weight of the past months beginning to lift. It wasn't complete victory. It wasn't full custody, or the immediate restoration of everything he had lost, but it was movement in the right direction, and sometimes that was enough. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Major Chen from Walter Reed. General Foster wanted you to know she was praying for your hearing today. She says if they can't see how good you are at taking care of people, they're not paying attention. She also says when you're ready, she'd like to meet the person who refused to let her disappear. Nolan read the message 3 times, then saved it alongside General Foster's email. 2 pieces of evidence that his actions had mattered, that his refusal to look away had created ripples that extended far beyond what he could have imagined. He walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it had in months. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., a general was relearning how to speak. And in 2 weeks, Nolan would have 4 unsupervised hours with his daughter, a chance to show her that the person she was proud to call her father was someone worth knowing. The story wasn't finished, but the ending was beginning to take shape, and for the first time in longer than Nolan could remember, it looked like something he could live with. 3 months later, Nolan stood outside Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, his hands in his jacket pockets to hide their trembling. The building rose before him, imposing and official, and for a moment, he felt like the same uncertain veteran who had left military service years ago, unsure of his place in a world that no longer needed his particular skills. But he wasn't that person anymore. The custody evaluations had continued favorably. His unsupervised visits with Summer had expanded to full weekends, and the janitor who had once pushed a mop through hospital corridors was now standing at the entrance of one of the nation's premier medical facilities, invited by a 4-star general who wanted to thank him personally. Major Chen met him in the lobby, her smile genuine and warm. Mr. Curtis, thank you for coming. General Foster has been looking forward to this meeting for weeks. She led him through security checkpoints and down corridors that smelled of antiseptic and determination. I should prepare you. She's made remarkable progress, But she's not the same person who went into that helicopter 3 months ago. The injuries, the time in limbo, they've changed her. But her spirit, that's still intact. They stopped outside a private room, and Major Chen knocked softly before opening the door. Inside, seated in a wheelchair by the window with afternoon light streaming across her face, was General Thania Foster. She was thinner than her official photos suggested, her hair cut short for medical necessity, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had carried her through 2 decades of military service. "Mr. Curtis," she said, her voice slightly slurred, but unmistakably strong. "Finally, I get to see the man who refused to let me vanish." Nolan stepped forward, suddenly unsure of protocol. "Did you shake hands with a general? Salute?" But General Foster extended her hand first, and he took it, feeling the strength in her grip despite the tremor that spoke of ongoing recovery. "General Foster, it's an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine," she replied, gesturing to a chair beside her. "Please, sit. And call me Thania. I think we're beyond formalities." Once Nolan was seated, she studied him with an intensity that felt like being assessed for deployment readiness. "Major Chen tells me you were a combat medic, 12 years of service." "Yes, ma'am." "Then you understand what it means to be written off. To have people look at you and see only damage, only limitations." Thania's gaze didn't waver. "They did that to you after your discharge. They did that to me after my crash. But you refused to accept it for either of us." Nolan felt his throat tighten. "I just paid attention. That's all." "That's everything," Thania corrected gently. "In a system designed to process people efficiently, paying attention to the individual is an act of rebellion. You rebelled on my behalf when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That matters more than you know." They talked for over an hour about the investigation into her helicopter crash that was revealing a network of procurement fraud involving millions in misallocated military funds, about her slow progress toward regaining speech and mobility, about the strange fellowship of people who had been dismissed by systems that preferred efficiency over truth. "I'm going back to work," Thania said as their visit drew to a close. "Limited capacity, advisory role, but I'm going back. They tried to silence me, accidentally or deliberately, and they failed. I have unfinished business with the people who thought they could make me disappear." She reached out and took Nolan's hand again. "And you? What's next for you?" Nolan thought about summer, about the upcoming weekend where they would go to the science museum she had been asking about for months, about the slow rebuilding of a relationship he had feared was permanently broken. "I'm going to keep being present," he said. "For my daughter, for the people who need someone to notice them. That's enough." "That's more than enough." Thania agreed. "That's everything." As Nolan left Walter Reed and headed toward the metro station, his phone buzzed with a text from Summer. "Dad, Mom says you're coming to get me Friday, and we have the whole weekend. Can we get pizza and watch movies and go to the museum?" He typed back, "Yes, to all three. I love you, sweetheart." Her response came immediately. "I love you too, Dad. I'm proud of you." Nolan stood on the platform waiting for his train, reading those 4 words over and over. "I'm proud of you." From a daughter to a father who had spent years trying to prove he was worthy of that pride. From a child who understood, perhaps better than any adult, that worth wasn't measured by job titles or diagnoses, but by the willingness to show up and care when it would have been easier not to. The train arrived, and Nolan boarded, finding a seat by the window. As the city rolled past, he thought about General Thania Foster relearning how to walk, about Clara Jennings fighting for patients who couldn't fight for themselves, about all the people who refused to accept that some lives mattered less than others. He thought about a janitor who had pushed a mop bucket down a hospital corridor and noticed what 22 surgeons had missed, not because he was smarter or better trained, but because he had taken the time to see someone as a person rather than a diagnosis. And he thought about his daughter, waiting for Friday with the excitement of a child who believed her father was someone worth being proud of. The train carried him home through the fading afternoon light, toward a future that was still uncertain but no longer felt impossible. He had learned something important in those long nights of watching and documenting and refusing to look away, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply bear witness to another person's struggle and refuse to accept their erasure. It wasn't the kind of heroism that made headlines or changed systems overnight, but it was the kind that reminded people they mattered, that someone was paying attention, that they weren't alone in the darkness. And in the end, Nolan thought, maybe that was the most important kind of saving there was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.